Hello and welcome to Tête-à-Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Volker Türk. He is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he joins us from Geneva as we mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you very much for being with us.
Glad to be here with you.
I want to begin, of course, with the situation in Gaza. How would you describe what is happening in Gaza from a human rights standpoint?
I mean, what is happening at the moment has to be described in the starkest possible terms. We have a humanitarian catastrophe. It's apocalyptic. We have ongoing bombardments. We have ongoing military operations by Israel. And we have people who have been multiply displaced, who have nowhere safe to go. And as the Secretary General said yesterday, this is one of the gravest situations that we face, and it really has huge implications from a human rights and from an international humanitarian law perspective.
You've talked about, quote-unquote, atrocity crimes being committed in Gaza. Do you mean more specifically war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide?
So, well, atrocity crimes is a cover term that looks at war crimes, crimes against humanity, but also genocide. We have not determined exactly the crimes that have been committed because, of course, this is for a legal court to decide. But it is very worrying because what we see are grave breaches of international humanitarian law when it comes to the blockade, for example, when it comes to the use of explosives with wide area effect in densely populated areas. And the facts speak for themselves. You have over 7,000 children who died. You have over 4,800 women who died. So there is an issue about respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law.
So would you say that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians in Gaza?
No, so what happens when war breaks out? There are principles, fundamental principles of precaution, proportionality, and of necessity that need to be respected, and distinction. It is extremely difficult in the current situation to say whether each of these principles have been applied. But what we can say is, and that's again, the facts speak for themselves, if you have over 7,000 children who had been killed, if you have 70% of the victims, women and children, there are very serious issues that arise from the perspective of whether or not this is proportional, whether the principle of distinction has been applied, and whether or not precaution has been made. And quite frankly, if you look especially at the blockade of Gaza, we have hardly humanitarian assistance coming in commensurate to the incredible needs. These are very serious issues that arise from an international humanitarian law perspective. Right. So we have very serious issues with this.
Right. The Secretary
And I should add, there's also dehumanizing language. We also have the issue of dehumanizing language, both on the Hamas side, but also on the part of some of the Israeli political and military leadership who have used language that dehumanizes the other, and that's very concerning in such a context.
Right. The Secretary General of the UN is obviously very concerned. On Wednesday, he called on the Security Council to declare an immediate and binding ceasefire using a rarely invoked article of the UN Charter, Article 99. What does it tell you about how he feels and how, I would say, the UN feels about what's happening in Gaza and beyond?
This is a situation of the gravest concern. And that is exactly what the Secretary General, on behalf of all of us, is expressing in sending a letter to the Security Council invoking Article 99. He has never done this before. The first time that he does it because of the collapse of the humanitarian system that would normally have to be there when war breaks out. But we cannot pretend to the world that there is any meaningful humanitarian assistance under these circumstances. And that's, if you like, a clarion call to the world to wake up to the situation in Gaza.
What about the crimes committed by Hamas on October 7th? And there's more evidence coming out of sexual crimes being committed. What is the UN doing about it? Because the Israelis feel that the UN is looking the other way.
I mean, it's clear what Hamas did is utterly unacceptable, is to be condemned in the strongest terms. And we have just been made aware, in fact, last week, of mounting evidence about sexual violence that has been used. It's utterly unacceptable. It needs to be investigated. I asked Israel already very early on to deploy a team to Israel to look into both what happened on the 7th and the 8th and to document it. And I hope that I will be able to deploy a team to precisely do this type of work.
Has Israel refused your proposal?
They have not. We are still working on it.
In Europe, also in the US, we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th. Is this a concern for you? There's also obviously some concern about Islamophobia and the rise of the far right in many areas in Europe and beyond.
I'm extremely concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism, also the rise in anti-Muslim bigotry. We have seen things that we haven't seen before, especially when it comes to some of the anti-Semitic attacks. This is totally unacceptable, and we need to work to actually address it head on, including within a society. It's very important that incitement to hatred, incitement to violence is addressed, both when it comes to defacing or to making comments, but also especially on the social media side, because we have seen things that we thought were no longer possible in the 21st century, and it's really important to address it head on.
Right. I want to touch briefly on the issue of migrants, especially asylum seekers, be it from Afghanistan, Syria, Sub-Saharan Africa, Haiti, Venezuela. They seem to be less and less welcome in rich countries. Is this also a concern that's maybe under the radar?
Look, you mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 75 years ago, adopted in a context of 2 world wars, the Holocaust, gross violations of human rights. One of the achievements was Article 14, the right of everyone to seek asylum from persecution. This applies to each and every country. There is a refugee convention, a specific human rights instrument when it comes to the protection of refugees. And we expect that this is recognized both in the global north and in the global south. And it's true, we have seen public debates that again, dehumanize refugees and migrants. And that is extremely worrying because it then influences legislation that, frankly, is sometimes not in line with international human rights standards and in line with international refugee law.
The last issue I want to touch upon, speaking of under the radar, and I know it's an issue that you care about, it's Sudan. Since the fighting resumed back in April, some 9,000 people died, 5.6 million have been displaced. This Wednesday, the United States State Department determined that both warring sides, the Sudanese Armed Forces of General al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group of General Hemeti, had committed war crimes. And according to the US, the Rapid Support Forces have also committed crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. Do you share that assessment?
Look, the situation is absolutely disastrous, and I'm glad you talk about Sudan because it's important that the world focuses its attention on it. And it's horrible that these 2 men have essentially leading their armies against each other at the expense of the people of Sudan with horrible consequences, including what you just mentioned. We have documented violations of sexual violence, for example. We have documented indiscriminate attacks on civilians. We have documented all kinds of very, very serious and grave breaches of international humanitarian law. And the only hope is that everyone who has any influence over them asks them to stop this war and come to senses. I met with both of them last year. I asked them to be abiding by international law, and I'm devastated that it's not happening.
Right. I want to speak especially about Darfur, the Darfur region. Obviously, there is a somber past there, and some are fearing that we're seeing this happening again. The U.S. And others are pointing especially to the paramilitary group, the RSF, targeting dark-skinned communities in Darfur, especially the Mathalit. There was a massacre in early November in a village called Ardamata. Can you tell us what you have been able to gather about this massacre and what's happening in Darfur?
So what's happening in Darfur is extremely worrying. I mean, we see that both the RSF and some of the affiliated militias are stoking up again inter-ethnic violence. They use methods that are they are horrific, such as sexual violence. Massacres have been happening. We are all investigating them. And we are still in the process of doing the one on the latest one. We have documented previous ones. And it is very important that, again, whoever has influence over them makes it absolutely clear that that accountability needs to be served and that is not acceptable under these circumstances. And frankly, I hope that accountability and justice will be served, because that has been one of the missing links in on the Sudan file.
Volker Türk, I want to thank you very much for appearing here on France 24, and I want to thank you all for watching this program. Thank you very much.